The human body can endure precisely 48 minutes at 30 degrees below zero before major organs begin to shut down. Sarah knew the brutal math. As the distant drone of a rescue plane finally vibrated through the ice, she realized her ultimate survival strategy, absolute freezing stillness, was about to become her tomb. November 14th began with the kind of piercing blue skies that lured bush pilots into a false sense of security. Sarah Jenkins, a 32-year-old glaciologist on contract with a private environmental firm, sat in the co-pilot seat of a battered Cessna 185 Skywagon. At the controls was Arthur "Artie" Collins, a grizzled 60-year-old aviator who knew the Alaskan interior better than the lines etched deep into his weathered face. They were charting ice recessions deep within the Wrangell St. Elias National Park, a formidable expanse of jagged peaks and ancient ice larger than the country of Switzerland. The flight was supposed to be a routine 3-hour loop from McCarthy over the Nizina Glacier and back. As they banked over a ridge of jagged granite, Artie tapped the altimeter, muttering something about a pressure drop. Sarah didn't pay it much mind. She was too busy swapping lenses on her camera, trying to capture the ethereal sapphire blue crevasses far below. Then the world tore apart. It wasn't a sputtering engine or a gradual descent. It was a violent, catastrophic mechanical failure. A high-pressure oil line ruptured directly behind the cowling. With a sickening crack, thick, black aviation oil sprayed across the windshield, instantly blinding them. At the exact same moment, the engine seized, emitting a horrific metal-on-metal screech that vibrated through Sarah's teeth. The single propeller which had been cutting through the thin alpine air at 2,000 revolutions per minute stopped dead. "Brace!" Artie roared, his hands wrestling the yoke as he instinctively tried to put the dead, blinded aircraft into a glide. But without forward momentum, the Cessna dropped like a stone toward the unnamed, snow-choked ravines of the Chugach-Wrangell border. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, crossing her arms over her chest as gravity left her stomach behind. The descent lasted perhaps 14 seconds, but in Sarah's mind, it stretched into a suffocating eternity. The impact was a sensory overload of shattering plexiglass, tearing aluminum and crushing force. The plane slammed into the side of a steep, snow-covered incline, snapping the right wing off like a dry twig. The fuselage barrel rolled twice down the slope before violently wedging itself between two massive ice-rimmed boulders. When Sarah finally opened her eyes, the silence was absolute, heavy and terrifying. She was hanging upside down in her harness, the bitter cold already minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, and dropping was rushing in through the shattered windshield. She tasted copper. Blood was dripping from a laceration on her forehead, freezing almost as soon as it hit her eyelashes. "Artie," she croaked, her voice barely a whisper in the vast stillness. She turned her head, pain flaring hot and sharp down her neck. Artie was slumped forward against the crushed instrument panel. The engine block had been pushed 2 feet into the cabin. She didn't need to check his pulse. The angle of his neck and the stillness of his chest told her everything. The veteran pilot who had survived 4 decades of Alaskan flying had taken his final flight. Panic raw and primal clawed at Sarah's throat. She fumbled with the metal buckle of her harness, her fingers already growing clumsy and numb. As she released the latch, she fell hard against the snow-packed roof of the inverted cabin. A scream tore from her lungs as white-hot agony exploded in her left thigh. Her femur wasn't pierced through the skin, but the agonizing shift of bone confirmed a severe fracture. Her lower ribs on the right side throbbed with a dull, grinding ache with every shallow breath. She was 32. She was married to a high school science teacher named David, who was waiting for her in Anchorage. She had a sister, Miranda, who was expecting her first child in Seattle. She was hundreds of miles from civilization, incapacitated, in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth, with a massive winter storm gathering on the horizon. Dragging herself backward using only her elbows and her good leg, Sarah managed to pull herself out of the crushed cockpit and into the slightly more intact cargo area of the Cessna. She needed to take inventory. Her survival depended entirely on what was within arm's reach. She found Artie's emergency ditch bag pinned beneath a crumpled aluminum strut. Fighting through the nauseating waves of pain from her leg, she pried it loose. Inside, she found a cruel joke of a bounty, one foil emergency blanket, a half-empty box of waterproof matches, a flare gun with exactly 2 magnesium rounds, a small roll of duct tape, and a crushed thermos that, miraculously, still held a few cups of lukewarm black coffee. There was no satellite phone. The plane's radio panel was smashed beyond recognition. Outside, the wind began to howl, sweeping dry, powdery snow through the breaches in the fuselage. The temperature was plunging rapidly as the brief, weak Alaskan sun dipped behind the western peaks. Looking out through the shattered window, Sarah saw nothing but endless undulating waves of white and grey. There was no smoke, no lights or no sign of humanity. She wrapped the flimsy foil blanket around her shoulders, shivering violently as shock began to set in. The reality of her situation settled over her like a heavy shroud. She wasn't just lost. She was trapped, and the cold, an invisible, relentless predator, was already circling. By the morning of the 3rd day, the world had shrunk to the dimensions of a frosted aluminum coffin. The storm that had rolled in on her first night had been apocalyptic. Howling winds had battered the wedged fuselage, threatening to dislodge it from the boulders and send it plummeting into the unseen gorge below. But the storm had also brought a terrifying twist to her predicament, Snow. Feet of it. The relentless blizzard had completely buried the white Cessna. To anyone flying overhead, the wreckage was now perfectly camouflaged, completely indistinguishable from the thousands of natural snowdrifts littering the mountain range. Sarah was entombed. The interior of the plane had become a dark, freezing cave. Frost an inch thick coated the inside of the aluminum skin. The temperature hovering inside was an estimated 20 degrees below zero. Standard survival manuals, the ones she had read during her wilderness training in Colorado years ago, dictated that a stranded person must keep moving. Jump shiver, do isometric exercises. Movement generates friction. Friction generates heat. But Sarah faced a deadly paradox. Because of her fractured femur, moving was an excruciating ordeal that caused her heart rate to spike, her breathing to become rapid and cold air, to flood her lungs, rapidly dropping her core temperature. Worse, she had no food. Her body had long since burned through the pathetic calories of the lukewarm coffee. Every calorie she expended through movement was a calorie she could not replace. If she kept trying to move to stay warm, she would literally burn herself to death from the inside out, accelerating her starvation and exhaustion. So Sarah Jenkins made a radical, terrifying decision. She decided to stop moving. Using her bare hands, she had painstakingly packed snow against the gaps in the torn fuselage, sealing herself in to block the deadly wind. She dragged the foam cushions from the rear seats and built a tiny insulated nest in the corner of the cargo hold. She cocooned herself in the emergency foil blanket, wrapped her jacket tight and tucked her chin to her chest. She slowed her breathing. She forced her muscles to relax, fighting the body's desperate, involuntary urge to shiver. She visualized a tiny ember burning in the center of her chest, focusing all her mental energy on keeping that imaginary heat centered around her vital organs. She sank into a state of deliberate torpor. She became a ghost, haunting her own body. The hours bled into days. The psychological toll of the absolute stillness was far worse than the physical pain. In the profound silence of her icy tomb, her mind began to betray her. She hallucinated conversations with David. She could smell the vanilla coffee he brewed every morning in their Anchorage apartment. She heard Miranda laughing. She saw Artie sitting perfectly unharmed in the pilot's seat, turning back to tell her they were almost home. Focus, she would tell herself, biting her cracked, bleeding lips to ground herself in reality. Save the heat. Stay still. Stay alive. Her extremities were the first to be sacrificed to the cold. Her toes lost feeling by the end of day 2. Her fingers became stiff, clumsy claws. Her body was executing a ruthless triage, pulling warm blood away from her limbs to keep her heart and brain functioning. She knew that if she survived this, she might lose her legs or hands. But the alternative was losing her life. On the afternoon of the 5th day, the sensory deprivation was shattered. It started as a vibration so deep and subtle, she thought it was just the beating of her own weakened heart. But the vibration grew into a low, rhythmic thrum. It resonated through the icy aluminum walls of the plane, vibrating against her cheek, where it rested on the frost-covered floor. Thrum, 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 thrum. It wasn't the wind. It was the distinct, synchronized hum of a twin-engine aircraft. A twin otter. A rescue plane. Sarah's eyes snapped open. Adrenaline, a forgotten drug in her frozen system, dumped into her bloodstream. This was it. They were looking for her. She needed to fire the flare. She had to get the flare gun from her pack force, open the crushed cabin door, and shoot a magnesium round into the sky. She commanded her right arm to move. Nothing happened. Panic seized her. She looked down at her arm. It was there wrapped in layers of frozen fabric, but it felt entirely disconnected from her brain. 5 days of profound immobility, combined with severe hypothermia, had effectively paralyzed her. Her muscles had locked into a rigid energy-saving stasis. "Move," she screamed in her mind. "Move, God damn it!" The sound of the plane was getting louder. It was flying low, doing a grid search right over the ravine. With a guttural sob, Sarah threw her entire upper body weight to the left. The sudden jerky movement tore at her frozen joints, sending blinding spikes of agony through her shattered leg. She collapsed against her survival bag. Her clumsy, frost-bitten fingers scrambled against the frozen canvas, scraping against the stiff zipper. The engine noise was roaring now. The plane was directly overhead. She managed to hook her thumb into the zipper ring and pulled. The bag tore open. She thrust her stiff hand inside her numb fingers, wrapping around the cold, heavy plastic handle of the flare gun. She dragged herself toward the rear cargo door, but as she looked up, her heart plummeted into her stomach. During the 5 days of her immobile hibernation, the blizzard had not only buried the plane, it had compacted. Hundreds of pounds of dense, ice-hardened snow were pressed against the exterior of the door. The very snow wall that had insulated her from the wind and allowed her to survive the freezing temperatures had now sealed her inside. The sound of the twin otter reached a deafening crescendo overhead, making the aluminum walls vibrate. She was completely invisible, buried in a white grave, holding a loaded flare gun she couldn't shoot. And then the sound of the engines began to fade. The low, rhythmic thrum of the twin otter's engines grew fainter, shifting from a deafening roar to a distant hum, and then agonizingly to nothing. Sarah lay slumped against the frozen canvas of the ditch bag, the heavy plastic handle of the flare gun cold and useless in her hand. The absolute silence of the icy tomb rushed back in heavier and more oppressive than before. A profound, crushing despair washed over her. She had endured the crash. She had survived 5 days in sub-zero temperatures with a shattered femur. She had played a dangerous game of physiological roulette by suppressing her own metabolism. And she had lost. Tears welled in her eyes, instantly freezing on her eyelashes, and sealing her eyelids shut. She let out a dry, ragged sob that tore at her throat. It was over. She was going to die here, buried in a nameless ravine, mere feet beneath a rescue crew that had no idea she existed. But as the initial wave of crushing defeat receded a small, rational glaciologist part of her brain, the part that analyzed data and recognized patterns sparked to life. Grid search, her mind whispered. Search and rescue pilots didn't just fly randomly over the mountains. They flew precise mathematical patterns, creeping lines, parallel tracks. If they had just flown directly over the ravine, they would bank turn and fly a parallel line just a fraction of a mile over. They would be back, not directly overhead, but close enough. She had perhaps 10, maybe 15 minutes before they made their return pass. She looked at the rear cargo door. The snow packed against it was dense and impenetrable, compacted by wind and gravity. She would never dig through it with her bare, frost-bitten hands in 10 minutes. She forced her frozen neck to turn toward the front of the wreckage, the windshield. During the crash, the thick plexiglass had shattered, leaving a gaping hole that had let the deadly cold in. On her first day, she had painstakingly packed soft, powdery snow into the jagged opening to create an insulated plug. That snow hadn't been compacted by the weight of a blizzard. It was just a fragile wall she had built herself. If she could reach it, she might be able to punch through. But reaching the cockpit meant dragging herself out of her insulated nest across the jagged frost-covered floorboards and maneuvering past Artie's frozen body. Sarah uncurled her legs. The pain that shot up her shattered right femur was so intense, so blindingly bright, that she nearly blacked out. Her vision swam with dark spots. Her muscles, locked in a rigid energy-saving stasis for nearly a week, screamed in protest. Every movement felt as if she were tearing her own ligaments apart. "David!" she rasped, using her husband's name as a mantra. "David! David! David!" She dug her elbows into the frost on the floor and pulled. She moved perhaps 3 inches. She pulled again. Another 3 inches. Her breath plumed in the freezing air, rapid and shallow. She was breaking her own rule. She was moving, and the precious hoarded heat in her core was rapidly bleeding away into the frozen aluminum beneath her. It took her 7 excruciating minutes to cover the 4 feet to the cockpit. She dragged herself over the crushed center console, her heavy, unresponsive legs trailing behind her like dead weight. She bumped against Artie's stiff shoulder, whispering a hoarse apology to her dead friend. She reached the snow plug, filling the shattered windshield. She raised her left hand, clutching the flare gun, and used the heavy plastic barrel to strike the compacted snow. Thwack! The snow was harder than she expected, fused into a solid block of ice from the moisture of her own breath over the past 5 days. Panic flared in her chest. She struck it again, and again. Small shards of ice chipped away, falling onto her lap. She needed a hole, just a hole big enough to shove the barrel through. Suddenly she felt it, a vibration in the metal frame of the plane. Thrum, 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 thrum. They were coming back. The sound was growing louder, approaching from the west. Sarah struck the ice plug with a frantic, desperate energy she didn't know she possessed. Her knuckles scraped against the jagged shards of plexiglass, tearing the skin, but she couldn't feel the pain. She was operating on pure, unadulterated survival instinct. With a final desperate thrust, the barrel of the flare gun broke through the crust. A blast of blindingly bright, sub-zero air rushed through the narrow 3-inch hole, stinging her face. She had breached the surface. The Twin Otter was roaring loudly now, banking slightly as it paralleled the ravine. Sarah shoved the barrel of the flare gun through the hole, pushing it as far out into the open air as her arm would reach. Her fingers were so numb, They felt like blocks of wood. She couldn't feel the trigger. She had to look down, visually guiding her index finger into the trigger guard. She squeezed. Her frozen finger lacked the strength. The engine noise was peaking. They were adjacent to her now. In seconds they would pass behind the ridgeline. "Please!" she screamed, though it was barely a whisper. She wrapped her left hand around the grip, brought her right palm up, and pushed against her own index finger with the heel of her hand. Crack, fsh! The recoil violently wrenched her wrist, sending a shooting pain up her arm. The flare erupted from the barrel, but the angle was wrong. Instead of shooting straight up into the sky, the heavy magnesium round glanced off the edge of the ice hole, careened horizontally across the snowpack, and buried itself deep into a massive snowdrift 30 yards away. Sarah watched in absolute horror as the tiny trail of smoke vanished. The flare hadn't flown. It had buried itself. The sound of the Twin Otter began to fade. The engines droned away, swallowed by the vast, indifferent expanse of the Chugach Mountains. Sarah let the flare gun slip from her deadened fingers. The hole she had painstakingly carved let in a vicious draft of wind, instantly dropping the temperature in the cabin. She had expended her final reserves of energy. She had broken her stillness. Her core temperature was plummeting. The shivering reflex, which she had fought so hard to suppress, finally overtook her in violent, uncontrollable spasms. She slumped sideways against Artie's seat as the darkness began to close in around the edges of her vision, dragging her down into the final, painless sleep of severe hypothermia. She didn't notice the strange glow illuminating the snowdrift outside. 2,000 feet above the ravine, Jackson Davis rubbed his bloodshot eyes. He was a spotter for the Alaska Air National Guard, and for the past 4 hours he had stared out the starboard window of the Twin Otter until the endless sea of white had induced a nauseating form of snow blindness. "Nothing on that pass, Captain," Jackson said into his headset, his voice heavy with fatigue. "Just more rocks and ice." Captain Miller, flying the Twin Otter, sighed. "All right, Jackson, we've got fuel for one more sweep up the valley. Then we have to RTB before the light fails. We're losing the sun." As Miller banked the heavy aircraft to port, turning it away from the unnamed ravine, Jackson took one last customary look back over the terrain they had just covered. He blinked. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead against the freezing plexiglass. "Captain," Jackson said, his voice suddenly sharp, "hold your turn. Level out." "What is it?" "I don't know," Jackson muttered. "Down in the ravine. At our 8 o'clock. Miller leveled the wings. Jackson grabbed his stabilized binoculars. Down in the monochromatic world of white and gray, something was fundamentally wrong. Beneath the surface of a massive snowdrift, there was a violent, unnatural glow. It was a searing chemical pink, pulsing beneath the powder like a radioactive heartbeat. It was the buried magnesium flare burning at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, rapidly melting a glowing cavern beneath the snowpack. "I've got a thermal anomaly," Jackson shouted, adrenaline spiking. "Neon pink. Looks like a submerged flare." Miller immediately banked the plane hard, diving toward the coordinates. Calling it in, getting the Jayhawk on standby. 45 minutes later, the deafening chop of a Coast Guard MH-60 Jayhawk helicopter shattered the silence of the ravine. Because the terrain was too steep and treacherous for a landing, the pilot held the massive helicopter in a stable hover 50 feet above the snow. Rescue swimmer Liam O'Connor and flight medic Carter Hayes rappelled down the hoist lines, dropping into waist-deep powder. The pink glow had long since burned out, leaving only a blackened, melted crater in the snowdrift. But it gave them a starting point. Using avalanche probes, Liam began systematically piercing the snow adjacent to the crater. 10 yards away, His metal probe struck something hard, metallic and resonant. Not rock. Aluminum. "Here!" Liam yelled over the rotor wash. "I've got metal." They deployed collapsible shovels and dug with a frantic, desperate intensity. The light was failing fast, the temperature dropping below -20. After 10 minutes of throwing heavy, compacted snow, Liam's shovel scraped against the iconic blue and white paint of a Cessna tail wing. They followed the fuselage down, digging a trench toward the front of the aircraft. When they reached the shattered windshield, Liam cleared away the ice plug and shined his high-powered tactical flashlight into the dark, frozen cabin. The beam swept over the crushed instrument panel, illuminating the frozen, lifeless form of the pilot. Liam's heart sank. "Pilot's a DOA!" Liam yelled back to Carter. He swept the light further into the cabin, expecting to find the glaciologist in a similar state. Instead, the beam caught a flash of silver foil. Liam leaned further in his shoulders, squeezing through the shattered windshield frame. Slumped against the passenger seat, wrapped in a frost-covered emergency blanket, was Sarah Jenkins. Her skin was a terrifying, waxy shade of grey. Her lips were blue. She wasn't shivering. She wasn't breathing, visibly. Liam reached out, pulling his thick glove off with his teeth, and pressed 2 bare fingers against her carotid artery. The flesh was shockingly cold, like touching a marble statue left out in winter. He waited. 1 second. 2. 3. A faint, incredibly slow flutter pushed against his fingertips. "She's alive!" Liam roared, his voice cracking with shock. "Carter, get the litter down here now. We have a viable survivor. Severe hypothermia we need. Warming packs. Stat." The extraction was a blur of calculated chaos. They had to cut through the remaining aluminum framing, to carefully slide Sarah onto the rigid rescue litter, keeping her body perfectly horizontal. With hypothermia, this profound, any sudden vertical movement could cause the cold, stagnant blood in her extremities to rush to her heart, triggering fatal cardiac arrest. As the hoist cable pulled the litter up into the belly of the hovering Jayhawk, Carter immediately began cutting away her frozen clothes, applying chemical heat packs to her armpits and groin. Her core temperature, when they finally managed to get a reading, was a deadly 81 degrees Fahrenheit. She was in a deep, hypothermic coma. 3 days later, the rhythmic beeping of a cardiac monitor pierced the fog of Sarah's unconsciousness. She opened her eyes. The bright, sterile lights of the intensive care unit at Providence, Alaska Medical Center forced her to squint. The air smelled of iodine and bleach. A warm hand enveloped hers. She turned her head slowly. David was sitting beside her bed, his eyes red-rimmed and exhausted, a scrub mask pulled down around his neck. When he saw her looking at him, a ragged sob escaped his lips. "You're back," he whispered, pressing his forehead against her heavily bandaged hand. "You're back." Sarah's throat was raw from the intubation tube that had been removed hours earlier. "Artie," she managed to croak. David's expression fell, and he slowly shook his head. Tears leaked from Sarah's eyes, hot and stinging against her wind-burned cheeks. Later that afternoon, a team of doctors crowded into her room. They were looking at her not just as a patient, but as a medical anomaly. "Mrs. Jenkins," the lead trauma surgeon said, looking at her chart with a mixture of disbelief and awe. "You survived 5 days in temperatures that should have killed you in hours. Your leg fracture prevented you from moving, which naturally led to extreme hypothermia." Sarah swallowed her voice, weak. "I tried to stop shivering. I tried to just stay perfectly still, to save the heat." The doctor lowered the chart. "You induced a pseudo-hibernation state. By not moving, you didn't force your body to expend energy it didn't have. You allowed your core temperature to drop slowly. essentially putting your major organs on ice, slowing your metabolic demand to a fraction of a percent. It's a miracle of physiological self-preservation. You sacrificed your extremities to save your heart. Sarah looked down at her feet. She couldn't feel them. The doctors had already told David that she would lose 3 toes on her left foot to severe frostbite, and the rehabilitation for her shattered femur would take a year. The physical toll was immense. The psychological scars would take even longer to heal. But as she looked out the hospital window, past the city of Anchorage, toward the distant snow-capped peaks of the Chugach Mountains, she knew the truth. The wilderness had tried to claim her. It had thrown its darkest, coldest fury at her. But in the face of the ultimate white abyss, she had found a way to win. She had beaten the brutal math. If Sarah's incredible story of survival and the sheer willpower to outsmart death inspired you, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs a reminder of human resilience, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more gripping real-life survival stories every week. Stay safe and never give up.